I guess some other just faith-based questions. So I guess in Christianity, how does God or how do Christians define what is right and what is wrong for people or for people to act?
So humans have always been nervous about report cards. And that seems to be a
Me.
universal condition, yeah. So, so again, the whole topic of right and wrong, of what is good and evil, for example, has to be approached first from a spirit of humility. If we're asking that question so that we are guaranteeing a passing grade for ourselves, we're probably starting in the wrong direction to begin with. Right and wrong have often been defined in very personal terms. And that's also part of the problematic side of it, because if it's defined in human terms, we will always use ourselves as a benchmark. And so therefore, right and wrong historically has been seen as what is best for me and my interests, what is best for me and my clan, what is best for me and my national group. And so then right and wrong becomes self-serving. Religion tries to move out of that. But even there, religion spends a certain amount of its time saying, this is what we believe, and therefore what they believe must be wrong because it's different. This is what we have taught, and therefore that lesson of someone else can't be as important because ours takes primacy. Now, the way to navigate that tricky relationship is to take the step back, and instead of beginning with right and wrong being self-referential, to start with the idea of right and wrong being other-referential. And most religions, and Christianity included, have tried that. Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, whose famous work talked about I and thou, that the I only becomes known when we have some experience of another, of the thou, the other person. So right and wrong, in the language of faith, in the language of Christianity, is saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So now you're starting already with an other-oriented action. Your first impulse is, how do I act towards another? And the answer comes back, well, you act in such a way as you would hope they would treat you. It's called the golden rule. The silver rule is the other version that talks about don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. And it is fairly common in all the religions. But to your point, rightness is that action that I would do that enhances life for another, and then as a reciprocal allows me also to flourish in my relationship with God and with the rest of humanity. So rightness is other-oriented. It's centrifugal, not centripetal. Wrong, sin, brokenness, is that which would destroy the possibility of nurturing life in another or in myself, and therefore damage the image of God in that other person and in myself. So the two great ways we stray are either moving towards the one end of the spectrum that is pride, that defines everything in terms of ourselves and our needs, or towards the other end of the spectrum of sloth, of saying, I'm not worth God's love. I'm not worth being cared for. I have no reality and no ground of being, no value, and therefore I can totally damage this vessel, and I can damage others along the way. When we can stop moving between those two extremes and instead can focus on the others and nurturing life in our relationships with them and with God and the world, then we're moving in a right direction.
So I guess kind of that relationship with, but through Jesus. So was Jesus considered infallible? Was Jesus considered all that is right in the world?
Oh, well, by the measures that I've just set up, this always very thin ice if you ask someone to pretend to speak for Jesus. The idea is that people, in telling the stories of Jesus and remembering him as clearly as they could, also were honest And there were times when Jesus himself expressed ideas that weren't fully correct, or at least didn't reflect a fullness of the message that he embodied. The one story that comes to mind is an encounter with the Syrophoenician woman on a road. In that day and age, when Jesus was traveling around the region, there were very strict rules from the dominant culture about whom you could eat with and talk to and have any sort of interaction with. And Jesus often broke those rules. He talked to the woman at the well in Samaria. He talked to the lepers and the tax collectors. But there was one occasion when a woman came to him who was from a village that he really shouldn't have had any contact with. And she asked for her child to be healed, for Jesus to offer a gift of love and healing for her child. And Jesus spoke to her fairly abruptly and did say, "Woman, it is not right for the children's bread to be given to the dogs." Now, it was a harsh language, and preachers through the ages have tried to waffle that down and claim he used the word for puppies instead of dogs and all sorts of gymnastics. But ultimately, Jesus is saying, out of his experience, his fully human reality, to a woman that culturally he was not supposed to interact with, that he could not stop in that moment and offer help to her family because he had a higher obligation to his own community. And the woman wisely said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs can eat the crumbs that fall from the table," and made Jesus stop. And he turned to the people around him and said that she had offered a wisdom greater than anyone else that he had heard. And he said, "Go, and as you wish, it will be done for you." So the honesty of the scriptures is that they kept that story in there. They kept a moment when Jesus' answer was not fully perfect. And some could say, well, he did that to teach his disciples. He put on the airs that they might see their own prejudice manifest in his words. But I think there was a reality of Jesus' human situation, where in that moment he spoke as a Palestinian man in the first century. And in that moment, another person became the teacher. And the wisdom of Jesus is that he could hear that and accept that and embrace that and grow, and that story would be remembered. So Jesus, even in that act, shows us the necessary humility and grace and openness that we should still emulate.
That's a good story. I know that. I do know that story, and it's a good one. In that, you talked about Jesus's humanness, which I think is important to discuss just to understand Christianity. So, Jesus human, Jesus divine. Can you talk a little bit about that for the listeners who may not know?
Sure. Yeah. So, again, the story of Jesus isn't told against a blank slate. There is a vocabulary in place that has shaped very much how the Jesus story was passed on, and it also was a story that was told for a purpose as opposed to simply being a reporter's narrative. So let me unpack that. It was important that Jesus be understood as human, because in that day and age, there were lots of stories of special beings who were supernatural, who were gods that became flesh. And there was also the understanding that if a god became flesh, well, then they were simply appearing human, but they weren't fully human. And that was a reality in the time when the stories of Jesus were written down. So it was important for the gospel writers to emphasize Jesus' humanity. So they emphasize a human birth, naming a human mother. They emphasize him being tired. They emphasize him eating. They emphasize him sweating, crying, weeping. They show him getting mad when he cleanses the temples. They show him praying fervently that the choices in front of him might pass away. So the humanity of Jesus was critical. And even in the resurrection stories, after Jesus is raised from the dead, look at what he does. He appears in the flesh and says, I'm not a ghost, feel my wounds. Do you have something to eat? And he asks for fish, or he asks for a piece of bread and eats with them. So the humanity of Jesus was important because if God's love is for us as humans, Jesus needed to be fully human. Otherwise, that love would have been a special, isolated case for Jesus that didn't apply to us. So the church has often and always talked about Jesus as fully human, fully feeling pain, fully feeling tired, fully feeling joy and laughter. Now, that did not ultimately define all that Jesus was. And so the language of divinity was also added there to talk about in the midst of the humanity, there was a larger reality that was also being displayed, manifest. And that reality reflected God, taught about God, and literally imparted the love of God. And it did it to such a high degree and a full degree that it was seen as divine. And therefore it had the capacity to overcome the limitations of human life through the miracles. It had the ability to know people's hearts when they hadn't shared the information. So early on, the church wanted to emphasize this oneness of Jesus with God by saying he ultimately had a divine nature. That divine nature and the human nature were together, and they were two co-present realities that people would see or experience depending on the situation.